Just Another Monster contains adult themes, violence, and content that may be sensitive to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Just Another Monster.
This is Season 1, Episode 8 of Just Another Monster, the show where we shed light on the monsters that live among us. Greetings, listeners. I hope those of you listening in the States had a happy and safe holiday weekend. This is going to be the last narrated episode for at least a few weeks, as I take a little time for myself to enjoy the upcoming holidays with some much needed time off. But I will be in the studio working on the first release of our Blacklight episodes starting the first week of December. I also wanted to take some time to mention that the official website for Just Another Monster has officially launched. If you go to justanothermonster.fm, you can stay up to date on information about the show, upcoming episodes, and you can even stream episodes directly from the site. I may even do a giveaway from time to time. This episode begins in 1989, Thanksgiving 1989 to be exact. It's the tragic story of a young woman who went missing while visiting family for Thanksgiving, a case that took nearly 30 years to solve. So, let's get on with it. Sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story. A story of just another monster. It was November 27th, 1989. It was cold that day. A chilling 37 degrees. It's the kind of cold that seeps right down to your bones and stings the numbness of your cheeks. Detective Ron Peterson was leading his search team, moving up and along the Nooksack River in a Zodiac boat. It's a kind of small inflatable fishing raft with a puttering engine attached to it. They'd been searching for a while, not knowing what they would find as they slowly glided along the icy cold river. No one spoke a word, and the silence was deafening. They decided to change course out of the main river channel and into a smaller, narrower side channel. And as they came around the bend of the river, Detective Peterson noticed something bright pink. It's a hue you don't often see along a forested riverbank. It stood out. This may have been her, the young woman they've been searching for. As the boat drew closer, they could see her, lifeless and blue. It was Mandy. Her body lay motionless face down at the edge of the riverbank like a discarded mannequin. The front half of her body submerged in the frigid waters of the Nooksack River. Her body lay undisturbed. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no stab wounds, no gunshots. The only visible evidence on her body was in the form of short, parallel, and serrated scratches along her legs, arms, and torso, like tiny little knife cuts. And she was completely nude, except for her bright pink running shoes. Her body was telling us a story, one that would take 30 years to unfold. This is the story of Mandy Stavik. And to tell her story, we have to go back to the beginning. Amanda, known to her friends as Mandy, was an upbeat 18-year-old who grew up in the small town of Acme, Washington. She was an energetic and charismatic teenager who had the world at her fingertips. She was a star athlete who played for the Mount Baker High School women's basketball team, and when she wasn't scoring three-pointers, she was a straight-A student, an active cheerleader who also ran track and played softball. She was also a seasoned equestrian. She had dreams of becoming an airline pilot because she wanted to see the world. She was that popular girl that you knew in high school. You know, the one with the perfect skin, sandy blonde curly hair, deep brown almond-shaped eyes, and a captivating smile. She was that girl that you knew would end up becoming prom queen and deemed most likely to succeed in the high school yearbook. Popular amongst her friends and the community, Mandy was well known throughout the small town of Acme. At the time, Mandy was attending her first year at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington, a small farming town on the east side of the Cascades. It was Thanksgiving break, so Mandy made plans to make the drive down to her hometown of Acme. It was there that she would reconnect with her family who still lived in the South Fork Valley. Mandy invited her roommate Yoko to come with her. Yoko was a Japanese exchange student who didn't have any family in the States. Mandy and Yoko quickly became close friends, and they even worked together to learn each other's spoken languages. The two of them decided to make the drive up from Ellensburg with Mandy's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Rick Zender. The trio made the 3-hour-long trek over the snowy Cascades and up north to Acme. Acme is a small town, a very small town. Just 2 hours south of the Canadian border, Acme is a tiny working-class mountain town that sits in the middle of the South Fork Valley. The town itself is only 9 square miles in size with a population of just a little under 300 adults and children. Many of the working class in Acme are made up of coal and gas miners. It's the kind of small, tight-knit town where doors remain unlocked, where everyone knows one another, and they know one another's secrets. A town where generations of families were raised together and lived in the same homes they grew up in. The parents of many of the children raised in this town all went to the same schools together, and their children would also go on to do the same. It's the kind of town you see in a movie where the only businesses in town were prefixed with the name of the town, such as the Acme Diner, or the only grocery store, the Acme General Store, but these are actually real places. Mandy's family was originally from Palmer, Alaska. Her parents, Glenn and Mary Stavik, had been raising 2 boys and 3 girls in Alaska before moving to Acme. Glenn and Mary would eventually divorce in 1974. When Mandy was in the 7th grade, her and her mother moved down to Acme. Mary's best friend moved down to Whatcom County, and when Mary would visit, she fell in love with the area. It was a new start for them, especially after tragedy had already befallen the family. In 1974, when Mandy was only 4 years old, her older brother Brent Stavic was found dead in Alaska. At only 17 years old, Brent was killed while on a bow hunting trip. He reportedly died of 17 gunshot wounds to the head and chest by an unknown assailant. No clues or any reasons for the murder were discovered. He was simply found shot to death. While his case has never been solved, I think it's safe to say that 17 gunshot wounds to the head and torso would indicate murder and not a tragic hunting accident. So coming out of a divorce and dealing with the pain of losing a child, a new start was needed for Mary and Mandy. But this wouldn't be the only tragedy the family had to endure. In 1988, Mandy's 20-year-old stepbrother Spencer tragically drowned in a boating accident in the Kenai River, located just south of central Alaska. On November 22, 1989, Rick, Mandy, and Yoko made the long and scenic drive to Acme. Rick dropped off Mandy and Yoko at Mandy's parents' house. Yoko was going to stay with Mandy and her family to enjoy time together over the Thanksgiving holiday. Rick, who also lived in Acme, left to spend time with his own family. Mandy's mother, Mary, also had invited other extended family members to come into town to enjoy the holiday together. It was your typical Thanksgiving in the Stavic household. On November 24, 1989, the day after Thanksgiving, Mandy spent the morning eating leftovers and spending time with her family. Mandy had made plans with Yoko to go out later that evening with a high school friend of hers, Brad Gorham and Tom Bass. Later that morning, Mandy and Yoko decided to go for a nice morning walk together. They walked along Mandy's favorite running path. This was a 5-mile looping trail that ran along and past a main arterial road and in parallel with the Nooksack River. After returning home from their walk, Mandy and Yoko had more food and enjoyed more time with family. At around 2:30 p.m. that same afternoon, Mandy wanted to go for a brisk run along the same trail. Mandy was incredibly active, so this was pretty typical of her. Usually, Mary would ride her bike alongside Mandy. However, Mary had extended family visiting with her, so she was unable to go with her. Mandy instead decided to bring Kira along with her. Kira was the family's German Shepherd companion. Mandy and Kira left for their run together, and it would be the last time that anyone would ever see Mandy alive again. A couple of hours had passed since Mandy left, and Mary grew concerned when she hadn't returned from her run. But panic began to set in when Mary found Kira standing on her front porch, alone. Kira stood there shivering with her tail between her legs, and her feet and hindquarters were drenched and covered in mud. Mary then reached out to Rick Zender, Mandy's on-again, off-again boyfriend, along with several of her friends to see if anyone had seen her. Mandy's brother Lee was at a friend's house, which was located along Strand Road, and he saw Mandy and Kira run past the home. David Craker, a delivery driver, also mentioned that he saw Mandy run past his van along Strand Road towards her home, just about 1/8 of a mile from where Mandy's house was. But Mandy never made it home. That's when Mary called the local Whatcom County Sheriff's Office to report Mandy missing. Mary then reached out to a number of friends and neighbors to help look for Mandy. Rick Zender, Brad Gorham, and Tom Bass all joined in the search for Mandy. The search became incredibly difficult. As I mentioned before, our falls and winters in the Pacific Northwest can get cold and dark. The further north you are, the colder and darker it gets. The sun begins to set around 4 p.m. this time of year, and the long country roads that run through South Fork Valley are not well lit and are surrounded by dense and haunting forests. Mandy could be anywhere, and time was running out. A man named Alan Pratt assisted the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office with search and rescue, and he had noticed that Mandy's dog Kira was fearful and cowering with her tail tucked, and her hindquarters were covered in silt from the river. The search for Mandy continued for days. Many had volunteered to search some of the forest trails, while Detective Ron Peterson put together a team to search along the Nooksack River. The Nooksack River is 75 miles long. It is actually a merging of 3 main tributaries: the North Fork, the Middle Fork, and the South Fork. The South Fork is the largest section of the river, covering an expansive 50 miles that runs through Skagit County and re-enters Whatcom County and runs alongside Acme, Washington. On the morning of November 27, 1989, Detective Ron Peterson and his team boarded the Zodiac boat and continued their search along the South Fork section of the river. I think the hope was that Mandy simply got lost or injured somewhere in the vast forests around the river. But risk of hypothermia in the frigid fall evenings was very real. So while there was hope they would find Mandy and get her home safely, there was this underlying dread that something horrifying may have happened to her. At about 6 miles down the river from Mandy's home, the Zodiac boat started to approach an area known to the locals as the Homestead. It's here that the detective and his team decided to change course, out of the main river channel and into a smaller, narrower side channel. And as they came around the bend of the river, Detective Peterson noticed something bright pink. It's a hue you don't often see along a forested riverbank. It stood out. As the boat drew closer, they could see her, lifeless and blue. It was Mandy. Her body lay motionless face down at the edge of the riverbank like a discarded mannequin. The front half of her body submerged in the frigid waters of the Nooksack River. Her body lay undisturbed. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no stab wounds, no gunshots. The only visible evidence on her body was in the form of short, parallel, and serrated scratches along her legs, arms, and torso, like tiny little knife cuts. And she was completely nude, except for her bright pink running shoes. Detective Ron Peterson, a father himself, carefully reached out to Mandy and pulled her still body into the Zodiac boat. His heart shattered, and all he could say while fighting back tears was, "I got you." The news of Mandy's death had a devastating impact on her family and the small community of Acme. Her family already endured losing 2 children, and now they just lost Mandy. Mandy's body was taken to Gary Goldfogle, the Whatcom County medical examiner, to perform the autopsy. It was determined that Mandy had drowned, as water from the river was discovered in her lungs. However, she was likely unconscious, as she was discovered to have had a severe concussion near the top right of her forehead, likely the result of a very significant blow to the head with a rock or possibly even a gun, one that could have rendered her unconscious. It was also determined that the head injury occurred immediately before or after her death. Semen was also found in her body, which indicates that she was sexually assaulted. Samples were then collected and sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for analysis. The crime lab was able to develop a male DNA profile from the semen. The small serrated scratches along the front side of her legs, torso, and arms were determined to have been from the thick overgrowth of blackberry bushes that lined the bank of the river, which means she was alive when she received them. She was alive and running through the blackberry bushes, likely running from her unknown attacker. It's believed that Mandy was able to fend off her attacker and made an attempt to escape, but was eventually hit over the head, sexually assaulted, and dumped in the Nooksack River, where she ultimately drowned. However, the manner of her death was listed as undetermined by the Whatcom County Medical Examiner. Detective Ron Peterson, who was assigned to the case, had determined that Mandy was likely abducted along Strand Road, just less than a mile from her home. Alan Pratt, who is a human tracker, was also brought in to help with the search and rescue. During the search, he had discovered a disturbed spot on the shoulder of the road close to Mandy's home. There appeared to be several footfalls, possibly from two people, that appeared as if someone was rustling or walking around something, signs that would indicate some form of struggle. It's theorized that whoever abducted Mandy did so using a weapon of some sort and using a vehicle, as Mandy was a seasoned athlete and could pretty much outrun just about anybody. And due to Kira's behavior, she was likely kicked off the side of the road and into a ditch. But it's believed that she followed the vehicle 6 miles up the road and out to the Homestead field, and to the Nooksack River, where Mandy's body was found. She likely stayed there with Mandy for a while, as her paws, legs, and hindquarters, along with her tail, were soaked and covered in silt from the riverbed. And as Mandy laid unresponsive, Kira made her trek back home. This part of the story kills me. Imagining Kira witnessing her companion's life being taken away, and there was little she could do. But ultimately, it was the silt from the riverbed that gave detectives, along with search and rescue, a clue to Mandy's whereabouts. The detectives on this case were not used to having to investigate horrible crimes such as this one. Even worse is that this was 1989. DNA testing back then was still in its infancy and nowhere near what it is today. This kind of thing also just didn't happen in Acme. Things like car or hunting accidents were common, but a potential murder in such a small town where everyone knows one another? And Acme is not a place known for its crime. In fact, between 2009 and 2019, there had only been 12 murders. It was just something that was not commonplace for the small town. Investigators did initially question Mandy's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Rick Zender. They had been dating off and on for about 3 years, but otherwise had a healthy relationship. Rick was extremely forthcoming about his whereabouts and was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Now, the medical examiners were able to extract DNA from the semen found in Mandy's body, but unfortunately, there were no matches at the time. David Craker, the delivery driver that helped with the initial search and rescue of Mandy, told police that when he saw Mandy run past him, he noticed a truck following close behind her. David had stated that he noticed two men inside the truck who looked to be roughly in their 30s. Another man was reportedly seen in the area that Mandy initially went missing. A police sketch was drawn up and circulated, but unfortunately, this didn't result in any new information or suspects. A known drug dealer in the area by the name of John Wisniewski had reportedly been telling some of the locals that he might know who murdered Mandy, but this again resulted in no new evidence or suspects. In the following months, tips poured in and detectives continued looking into potential suspects or persons of interest. But as the months passed by, the phone stopped ringing. no more tips came in. And then months became years. And years became decades. And Mandy's murder remained unsolved for 24 years. Work on Mandy's case continued, however. In fact, it would exchange hands with 3 different detectives throughout the years. In June of 2009, a new lead investigator was assigned to the case, Detective Kevin Bohay. Detective Bohay had attended the same high school as Mandy, and he had been familiar with the case already. As Detective Bohay went over all of the witness statements and tips, he wanted to go back and question a couple of persons of interest, specifically the drug dealer John Wisniewski, who was now living in Cambodia at the time. Detective Bohay actually made the trip to Cambodia. It's 9,000 miles. To speak with John Wisniewski and to further question him about his knowledge of who may have taken Mandy's life. Unfortunately, this was a dead end. Once Detective Bohay was able to question John Wisniewski, John denied having any knowledge of the person responsible for Mandy's murder. Of course, Detective Bohay didn't believe him. But unfortunately, a hunch or a gut feeling isn't evidence, so this was just another dead end. But this was a detective that refused to give up, clearly, as he was willing to make a trip 9,000 miles to talk with a person of interest. That's dedication. Detective Bohay began asking for DNA samples from anyone who lived in the area or may have come in contact with Stavic near the time of her death. This was part of what he called a DNA sweep. Over 80 DNA samples were collected, but none of them were a match. At this point, the chance or possibility of finding Mandy's killer was starting to look pretty grim. Tales of Mandy's murder continued to haunt the small town where everyone knew one another and one another's secrets. Many people who lived in the small town in the South Fork Valley continued to theorize what happened to Mandy, and especially about the person who was responsible for it. It was like a dark, ominous cloud that hung over the small town, muting the once bright colors of the valley and the scenic mountain views. Many wondered if the case of Mandy Stavik and the Menace of South Fork would ever be solved, or if this dark, ominous cloud would continue to consume the small town of Acme forever. In June of 2013, a group of mothers decided to take their kids to a local water park on a hot summer day. The small group of moms sat in the shaded grass and talked about life as they watched their children careen down the aging water slides. At some point during the group conversation, one of the mothers had brought up the unsolved murder of Mandy Stavik. This ended up sparking a conversation between 2 mothers that both attended Mount Baker High School but barely knew one another. These 2 women were Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson.
Are you talking about Mandy Stavik? I've never told anyone this, but I think I know who killed her. You do? I do too. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. But I mean, it's a small town, and it's a pretty serious thing to accuse someone with, especially without any kind of proof.
What happened that makes you think you know who did it?
Well, there was this guy I knew when we were in high school, and he was just really weird, and he really creeped me out. I was about 15 years old. Some friends and I went to a softball game. After the game, a bunch of us decided to go to Dairy Queen, so a bunch of us just piled into our friend's truck. There was this older guy there who sat next to me in the truck, to be in his 20s or something. Anyhow, he kept making these creepy comments, like how he loved my eyes and how beautiful my eyes were. It just really made me uncomfortable. And then he takes a pen out of one of the cubbies in the truck, and he starts running it up and down my knee. I was wearing these cut-off sweatpants, and I don't know, it just really stuck with me, and he was just so weird and creepy.
Ugh, that sounds very creepy. And you were only 15?
Yes. Tim always kind of creeped me out back then.
Wait, Tim? Do you mean Tim Bass?
Yes. Do you know him?
Yes. He's a friend of my husband's. I never told anyone about this either, not even my husband. But about 20 years ago, he came to my house and said he wanted to have sex with me.
Wait, what?
Yes. So I was home by myself one night with a baby, and I heard this knock on the door. When I opened the door, it was Tim. He said he'd been out hunting all day and asked if he could use the phone to call his wife. I didn't think anything of it because, it was Tim. I knew him from school, but I didn't know him that well. Anyway, I handed him the phone and he said that he was going to call his wife. He started pretending to talk to her, but I could hear that sound, when, you get the wrong number or it's disconnected, like the beep, 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 we're sorry message.
Yeah.
Anyhow, he ends up walking through my kitchen to the back of the house and into my bedroom, and I'm thinking, okay, this is weird, and I'm starting to get scared. He walks straight into my room and sits on the bed and says that he used to drive by our house all the time and watch me, and that he's always been in love with me, and he wanted to make love to me.
Oh my God, are you serious? What did you do?
Well, I told him that he needs to leave my house immediately. I was terrified.
Did he leave?
No, he refused. So then I told him he either leaves or I'm calling the cops. And he just got up and walked out. I've never spoken to him since then.
That is terrifying. We need to tell someone. This is just too strange of a coincidence.
I always thought it was Tim, but I was always afraid to say something.
Me too. Okay, so we should go to the police and tell them.
After realizing the two women both had suspicions about the same man, not to mention incredibly disturbing and frightening experiences with him, they decided to reach out to another Mount Baker High School graduate, Detective Ken Gates. It was time. It was time to talk to Timothy Forrest Bass. Timothy Forrest Bass lived just a few houses down from Mandy. In fact, Mandy's regular running route ran right past Tim's house. Tom Bass, the same Tom that Mandy had plans with the night she disappeared, is Tim Bass's brother. Tom described his brother Tim as very competitive, and they played like normal brothers often did. But as Tim got older, things like social interactions didn't come naturally to him. He'd always been a bit of a loner. But in his teen years, Tim began to exhibit some very troubling behaviors. Tom recounts a night where Tim was on the phone with his high school girlfriend who had just broken up with him. He was alone and on the phone in his bedroom with a pistol. At some point during the conversation, Tim stated, "I'm just gonna kill myself," and he ended up firing the pistol. Tim actually ended up firing the pistol into the ceiling of his own bedroom. After that night, people close to Tim started to notice some significant changes in his behaviors. He became bitter and angry and resentful, particularly of women. He began to view women as lesser than him. Robin Bass, Tom's wife, was witness to this behavior, and she herself felt that Tim truly believed women were inferior to him. Tim eventually married when he was 22 years old, just 6 weeks after Mandy's murder. He ended up marrying another Mount Baker High School graduate, Gina Malone. Shortly after marrying, the pair moved away to a neighboring town. Gina Malone recalls her marriage with Tim Bass and best describes it like she went to prison, far from the ideal fairy tale marriage that she had hoped for. Her marriage to Tim was an escape, really, a means to get away from the small town of Acme. Gina stated that Tim was a very controlling and emotionally abusive husband, and she endured this throughout their nearly 30-year marriage. Gina felt like she was his in-house servant. He was constantly making demands of her to make him food or get him a drink, and if she refused, he would berate her. But Gina remained in her marriage for nearly 30 years, and she ended up having 3 children with Tim Bass. Gina was terrified of Tim, and she did make attempts to leave him. In fact, there was one time where she was attempting to leave him once and for all. At one point during their marriage, Gina got a restraining order against Tim and left for 4 months. During that 4 months, Tim continued to harass her as she started to move forward with divorce proceedings. Tim responded with, "I am going to lie to the judge
and get the kids taken away from you."
Gina, who loved and adored her children, a mother who would do anything for them, went back to Tim, fearful of losing her children. Detective Ken Gates went to Detective Bohay with the information he received from Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, the two mothers who suspected Tim Bass after all these years. Around this time, Detective Bohay was conducting a DNA sweep based on a list of people he wanted to get DNA samples from. Armed with the information he received from Detective Ken Gates, Detective Bohay made the drive to Everson, Washington, where Tim Bass was now living with his wife and 3 children. Detective Bohay arrived at the home of Tim Bass and his wife Gina with the intention of speaking with Tim about Mandy. When Detective Bohay mentioned that he was investigating Mandy Stavik's death, he had asked Tim if he knew her. Now, remember, Tim grew up just a few houses down from Mandy, less than 2 miles away, and she was friends with his brother Tom. Tim initially denied knowing Mandy or even hearing that name before, and the detective felt that Tim was putting on a bit of a show. Tim eventually responded with,
Mandy.
"Oh yeah, that was the girl that was found in the river." Then Tim continued to tell detectives he didn't know Mandy and had no idea where she lived. When the detective asked him for a sample of his saliva to get his DNA, Tim refused. He stated, "Well, I don't want to give my DNA. You know, I've watched those crime shows.
I see how many people go to prison because they've given DNA."
It was at this time that the detective decided it was time to dig into Timothy Forrest Bass a little further. See, back in 1989, no one ever suspected the Bass family of any involvement in Mandy's murder. The Bass family was well known and well liked within the community. No one even considered even approaching the family back then, as they were the idyllic version of a small town family. Tim also had no police record. He pretty much just kept to himself. Tim Bass nor his father or brother were even asked to give a DNA sample either. For 25 years. Now, had they gotten DNA samples from either the father or Tim's brother, Tom, that would have been the end of the investigation, as it would ultimately point to Tim. And for that 25 years, Timothy Forrest Bass was living a quiet life, married with 3 children in a nearby community, and working as a delivery truck driver for a bakery. After Detective Bohay's encounter with Tim Bass, he decided to assign a surveillance team to observe him. The surveillance team followed him all night long on his bakery delivery route. They were hoping that Tim might throw out a piece of garbage or anything that he may have handled in hopes of getting a DNA sample, but they had no luck with this approach. Bass was very meticulous and cautious about leaving any kind of trace, so getting his DNA was going to be more difficult than detectives initially thought. Since Tim Bass was refusing to provide a sample of his DNA without a warrant, obtaining a warrant for his DNA was going to be even more challenging, as you can't simply ask a judge for a warrant because of a couple of gossiping moms at a water park had a suspicion. And Tim had no police record. It was going to take a lot more. In February of 2015, Detective Bohay reached out to Kim Wagner, who was the manager for the Franz Bakery outlet store that Tim Bass delivered for. The detective was hoping to get consent to swab the delivery trucks for touch DNA, and Detective Bohay never mentioned which employee he was investigating. Wagner informed the detective that he would need to speak with the corporate offices to get their permission. Unfortunately, when the detective did reach out to the corporate office, they refused to give any consent to any form of search of its vehicles. So it was back to square one. But that same month, Detective Bohay reached out to Tim Bass again to see if he would consent to a DNA sample. He again refused. But this time, Tim became incredibly anxious. And during a conversation with his brother Tom, he stated he was worried because he had sex with Mandy Stavik while she had been home for Thanksgiving in 1989. That's right. The very same person who flat out denied even knowing Mandy just 2 years prior was now claiming he was having a sexual relationship with her. Tom was stunned by the statements, and he asked Tim how this had happened, and Tim responded,
"Oh, I just went up to her and said, 'Oh, you're
keeping fit, huh?'
And that was it."
Tim then told his brother that he and Mandy had slept together a couple of times before she had gone off to college as well. Tim also then asked his brother to tell police that he also slept with Mandy, to imply that she slept around, as if that would somehow change anything. It's almost as if he knew that the DNA evidence would be conclusive and could potentially put Tom at the scene of the crime, just as much as it could with Tim. Several days later, Tim and his wife Gina were having a conversation with Bass's mother Sandra. It was clear that Tim at this point was grasping and desperate. They were discussing the current situation Tim was being faced with, and during that conversation, Tim asked his own mother if she would agree to tell police that Bass's deceased father had killed Mandy. Yeah, really. His mother, Sandra, simply put her face in her hands and said, no. Nearly 2 years passed with no progress on obtaining a DNA sample from Tim or a warrant to search his delivery vehicle. In May of 2017, Detective Bohay reached out to Kim Wagner again, the manager of the bakery Tim worked for. The detective wanted to inquire about the general areas of Bass's delivery routes. Kim had asked Detective Bohay if he was investigating the Stavic murder, and Bohay replied that he was. She then asked if the investigation had any relation to Bass, and Bohay confirmed that it was. It seemed that there were others that had their suspicions about Tim Bass. Kim Wagner would later state that Tim was weird and kind of off, that you never knew what version of Tim you were going to get that day, and the smallest things would just set him off and make him incredibly angry. And Wagner even experienced his disdain for women. Kim would state that he would never reference her by name. He would only refer to her as
woman.
At this point, Kim Wagner freely provided information regarding Tim Bass's regular delivery routes. Detective Bohay was interested in anything that Tim might discard, like cigarette butts, bottles, anything he might have drank from, anything he might have half-eaten or thrown away. The detective stated he would keep Wagner informed. After a few weeks, the detective reached out to Wagner to inform her that Bass never discarded anything. In fact, he became incredibly meticulous about anything he touched, as he started wearing latex gloves all the time. He even kept his garbage in his pockets, which we would then take home with him. Tim was not taking any chances. While they were talking, Wagner then asked if Bohay was looking for DNA, and when he confirmed that he was, she told him she could get it for him. Unfortunately, detectives cannot ask a civilian to involve themselves in matters like this, but Kim wasn't going to take no for an answer. The thought at this time was that she was working with someone who potentially murdered Mandy Stavik, and Kim Wagner was determined to find out. In August of 2017, Kim Wagner had observed Bass throw away a plastic cup that he had been drinking from in the employee break room. Kim's heart began to race as she thought that this was going to be it. After Bass walked away, Kim grabbed the plastic cup and placed it inside of a sealed plastic bag and stored it in her desk. 2 days later, she witnessed Bass drink from a soda can and discard it. Kim was able to retrieve the can and stored it along with the plastic cup in her desk. Now, Detective Bohay never directed Wagner to take these steps, nor did he inform her how to handle the items. Wagner was just determined to do it all on her own volition. After collecting the items, Kim Wagner then reached out to Detective Bohay via text to inform him she had 2 items that Bass had discarded. They agreed to meet at the Franz Bakery parking lot so Bohay could retrieve the items. The soda can and the plastic cup were immediately sent off to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for DNA analysis. The crime lab confirmed that the DNA collected from the soda can and the plastic cup that Tim Bass had used was a match to the male DNA profile collected from the semen in Mandy Stavik's body. Timothy Forrest Bass, the menace that plagued the small town in the South Fork Valley, was responsible for abducting, sexually assaulting, and ultimately murdering Mandy Stavik on November 24th, 1989. In December of 2017, Timothy Forrest Bass, who was 47 years old at the time, was arrested and charged with first-degree felony murder of Mandy Stavik. During Bass's interrogation, he continued to make claims of having a secret affair with Mandy. Everything I've said is truth. You know, it was more of a friendship type thing. We just talked. And then it just kind of grew into more of a physical thing, and we didn't even really do it that much. It was more kissing and stuff. Even in the face of insurmountable DNA evidence, Tim Bass attempted to uphold his innocence. While Tim Bass was in jail awaiting his trial, his brother and his mother, Sandra, had made several visits to Tim. Tom ultimately testified against his brother Tim, and during the trial, Tom had testified that during one of those visits, Tim was still trying to get his family to lie for him. He just said the cops are lying. Like, everyone is out to get him. Everyone is lying. He said, "They're gonna kill me in here." And the main point of it is he said, "I need a strong alibi or I'm going to prison." He said, "Mom, maybe you can say that we were Christmas shopping. Tom, do what you can." And then he said, "Maybe some of our other friends could say that they knew her back then as well." During the trial, Bass continued to make claims that he had a sexual relationship with Mandy, and that he had sex with her the same afternoon that she disappeared. Even his own defense team went with this argument, insinuating that Mandy and Tim would meet up secretly to have sex. Despite Bass's attempts to smear Mandy and her reputation and that of her families, the jury swiftly returned with a verdict of guilty on all accounts. On July 2nd, 2019, Timothy Forrest Bass was sentenced to 27 years in prison. During his sentencing, Timothy spoke for the first time during his entire trial, and he addressed the court. "I would first like to say that I am 100% innocent of this crime. Furthermore, I don't believe I received a fair trial. In saying that, though, the better man in me says that I should say very little today and give this day to the Stavic family." What a fucking asshole. A narcissistic asshole. Even in the end, when being faced with life in prison, he acts like he is doing the Stavic family a favor. Seriously, what a piece of shit. Tim is currently being held at the Clallam Bay Correction Center on the Olympic Peninsula. He is under what is considered close custody, meaning he is under constant and strict supervision, less freedom of movement, and is extremely limited on the personal property or programs that he can attend. He will be 80 years old before he ever sees the light of day again, if he lives that long. After all these years, Mandy's family finally had closure. But it will never bring Mandy back. Mandy will never be able to fulfill her dreams of being an airline pilot. She'll never experience having her own family or raising children. And she never got the chance to see the world or experience life to its fullest. And that's because her life was taken. Selfishly taken from us by a narcissistic misogynist, a woman-hating monster who roamed free for nearly 30 years. But in the end, it took a village, as they say. In fact, ironically and very fittingly, it was the courage and determination of 3 amazing women that brought this woman-hating monster to justice. And because of the actions of these 3 courageous women, a small town can now rest at ease. Mandy's family has the closure they deserve, and Mandy can now finally rest in peace. Suck it, Bass. Thank you for listening to Just Another Monster. Remember, if you are enjoying the show, please be sure to subscribe so you can get the latest episodes once they are released. And be sure to tell your friends about it. You can also follow me on Instagram at A Monster Show, where I share more information about the cases I cover. Or you can visit the website at justanothermonster.fm for the latest news. Thank you all for listening. Be safe and take care of each other. Until next time.